Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Billy Napier, the Florida Gators, starting to make some noise in the spring transfer portal window. We talked about Brendan Bett, who committed to Florida Saturday night. Another target emerging in former Michigan State defensive back Dillon Tatum, who this makes so much sense for the Florida Gators. And that's one of the things I love most about Billy Napier is that, especially in this portal window and even going back into the winter, Florida's not bringing in players just to bring in players. Like there is a ton of intent in terms of, hey, what kind of players are we going after and what do they provide to our roster? Like in an era of college football, where it just seems like so many teams are just, I want new players, and there's not much intent. They're just bringing in new guys. Florida has spent a lot of time retaining their roster from 2024 and then just going out. And we're not going to go out and make 30 plus additions, but the additions that we are going to make are going to make a lot of sense. Now, you look at Dillon Tatum and say, I think he could come into Florida and play a variety of different roles in the defensive backfield for Florida. But I think it just starts with, I think this kid is a really good football player. As a Michigan fan, Michigan went after this kid in a big time way out of high school. He ends up going to Michigan State. I've been following this kid for almost 4 years at this point. He was one of the better defensive backs when healthy, one of the better defensive backs that Michigan State has. Now, he was kind of forced to play out of position out on the boundary because he was just one of the better options that Michigan State had as a boundary cornerback. Think he could be a really good safety. Think he could be a really good nickel. And I'll say this, I have a ton of respect for 24/7 Sports. They do a phenomenal job recruiting guys or ranking guys out of high school, ranking guys out of the portal. This one couldn't disagree more with in terms of tell me there's 73 better safety prospects in the transfer portal than Dillon Tatum. Couldn't disagree more. And we'll kind of get into that. But I think this one makes a lot of sense. We're going to get into the reasoning. Before we do, and as always, to the Florida fans, just want to say thank you to you guys. And, many of y'all know at this point, it's been a lot of fun talking this team, really going back to that run they made in late November and then talking about what they've done on the recruiting trail and what they've done in the portal and what we've heard in spring practice. Cannot thank you guys enough for rocking with the fellas during the offseason months. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into this. Now, I think where I want to start here is Dillon Tatum, the versatility that he brings to Florida's defensive backfield, where you look at it and say, I would guess Florida is looking at him to play safety or nickel. And then you look at the depth chart and say, this makes a lot of sense. I think Florida has a lot of confidence in Jordan Castell and Bryce Thornton as your starting safeties in 2025. The depth in that room probably leaves a little bit to be desired. Now, one thing we got out of spring practice is, look, Drake Stubbs and Lagonza Hayward are guys that we like. And I think Florida has confidence that, hey, if we have to play them in 2025, they're going to be serviceable. But I think at the end of the day, when you're a Florida Gator team that wants to win the SEC championship and make the college football playoffs, which I'll say it again, like I think that is a legitimate conversation to have with this Florida team. Do you want to have to rely on your two deep consisting of two true freshmen that have never played Power 4 football yet? That's probably a question Florida's asking. You bring in Dillon Tatum, and I think Dillon Tatum could really push Bryce Thornton as the other starting safety next to Jordan Castell, but also just be a reliable safety that can be in your two deep that you don't have to throw a true freshman onto the football field if they're not quite ready. You talk about teams that want to win in November and December and January, want to make noise in the postseason. You have to be a team that has depth. And at the safety position, although we like these freshmen a lot, you probably want one more guy that has played quality football at the Power 4 level. Now, I think the other interesting conversation is nickel. I mean, Sharif Denson, Aaron Gates, I've been very vocal. Like, I like both of them, but both of them are dealing with some injuries. And you're not necessarily sure what it's going to look like going into 2025. This might be the best position for Dillon Tatum on this Florida Gators roster. And so you're bringing in a guy, different body types and skill set than a guy like Triquez Bridges, but very similar kind of addition where you bring him in and say, hey, you can play safety, you can play boundary cornerback. And look, Florida leaned on a guy like Triquez Bridges in the back half of the year and played very, very well. Now, I want to get a little bit more into the football player of Dillon Tatum. freshman year actually made some starts in the 2022 year as a true freshman at boundary cornerback, was the full-time starter as a boundary cornerback in 2023. And look, he played well. 42 targets faced, 24 receptions given up, 57% completion percentage, 6% missed tackle rate, which focus on that because it's hard to find defensive backs that can come up and tackle, especially if you're going to be playing nickel, especially if you're going to be playing safety. Like, we need those guys to come up and tackle in space. Dillon Tatum, he makes tackles in space and does not miss many tackles and is really physical at the point of attack. It's hard to find safeties that can operate in man coverage. And look, we know Coach Roberts is going to want to use their linebackers on some blitz packages. Well, when you're bringing blitz packages, normally you have to play some man coverage behind those blitzes. Safeties have to play man coverage. Dillon Tatum, with all the experience he has playing boundary cornerback, is certainly a safety that can hold up in man coverage. I think as a nickel defender, that's probably his best position, can play man coverage, but also is kind of 5'11", 210, and really, really good in run support. To me, you bring in Dillon Tatum, and look, I think he'd have the opportunity to, push for Bryce Thornton's spot. I think he'd have the opportunity to push for a starting nickel spot, but at the very least, be a very reliable two-deep member in 2025 that can play multiple different positions in a defensive backroom that, is a little bit thin. Florida was going to be picky. There's not a ton of guys that were in the spring transfer portal window that would come in and be in the two deep for Florida. To me, Dillon Tatum's one of those guys, especially at safety and nickel. And I kind of want to see this happen because I look at Dillon Tatum and say, look, he's been a solid boundary cornerback for Michigan State. Man, I just want to see him play in the right position, in a position where he really can maximize his skill set. And I think that excites a lot of Florida Gator fans with the potential addition of Dillon Tatum. Now, the other name, Florida, I think, very clearly wants to grab one more safety. Zaquan Patterson would make a lot of sense too. Now, I think the pushback that at least I have with Zaquan is that I don't know if he's a guy that you trust to play quality football in 2025. I think the upside, 3 years of eligibility plus a redshirt year to use, I think he can become a very good football player, very similar to the conversation we had about Gregory Smith, who left. I look at Zaquan and say that's almost like a 1-for-1 trade. Gregory Smith leaves, Zaquan Patterson comes in. Like, to me, that would make sense for Florida. I'd probably prioritize a guy like Dillon Tatum because I'm a big fan of the young safeties in Lagonza Hayward and Drake Stubbs. And if I'm going to add a safety or defensive back in the spring portal window, I want a guy that I trust a little bit more to play quality football in 2025. And to me, that's Dillon Tatum. We'll see if Florida, they're really the only program that's connected to Dillon Tatum as of right now. And I think he'd have the opportunity to come in and push Bryce Thornton. Like, Bryce Thornton played well, 500 snaps for Florida. It wasn't perfect. 23% missed tackle rate. Dillon Tatum only missed 6% of his tackles in 2023. And so I think he comes in, pushes for a starting spot, at the very least, a quality depth piece that can play multiple different positions. Now, another sneaky storyline coming out of this Florida Gators program, DJ Lagway's dad kind of updating on DJ Lagway, saying he's back to throwing footballs and, kind of going to be in the summer starting to ramp it back up, which I think is big. As much as the whole conversation we had in spring was, hey, just make sure DJ Lagway's healthy. The healthy DJ Lagway in 2025 is going to be dangerous. At the same time, this is a kid that's going into a second year of college football. You want him to be back as soon as possible so he can start developing again as a quarterback. That's really good news for Florida. Like, it sounds like everything's on schedule and he's going to be running this offense in fall camp. And I wanted to touch on this too, like a good NFL draft for the Florida Gators. I believe 7 picks. And again, that on paper is maybe like mediocre 7 picks for a program like Florida. Look, Tyreek Sapp would have been picked. Caleb Banks would have been a top 50 pick. George Gums probably would have been picked. I would think Jake Slaughter would be a top 50 pick. Austin Barber would have been picked. That number for Florida could have been 12 or 13 guys had some of these draft eligible guys left. I think that kind of speaks to where this program is going from a player development standpoint. There's been a lot of critique about Billy Napier in his first couple of years at Florida. And look, there's been plenty to critique. you're starting to see this roster come together. You're starting to see the player development happen on this roster. And I think the NFL draft kind of showed us that. We'll close it out there. Really interested to see if it gets ramped up between Florida and Dillon Tatum. We'll do a film breakdown of Dillon Tatum if and when he commits to Florida, because I think there's a lot to like about this kid. We'll close it out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.